Hello, this is Anacita Augustinus from the Department of Water Resources. I want to welcome all that are listening on our webinar to the Tribal Advisory Committee, California Water Plan Update for California Water Plan Update 2018. We're going to do a public review draft overview and have some time for some comments and discussion. We will be reviewing the California Water Plan Update. So I would like to go ahead and begin with introductions of who is in the room here and welcome you all to the meeting. Thank you. So we'll start on my left here.
Yeah, Kamyar Gavechi, Department of Water Resources.
Lee, Department of Water Resources.
DWR.
Paul Macera, DWR, Water Plan Team.
Brandon Ford, DWR. Tom Thor, DWR.
Thank you. And if we could start with those on the phone, please go ahead and introduce yourself and your tribal affiliation.
Are they unmuted?
Yeah, they are.
Is the volume?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's as high as...
okay, now they can talk. Sorry.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry, we just unmuted you all, so we could go ahead and begin with introductions from those of you in the on the phone.
River Nation.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
River Nation.
Okay, could you send a note of that? That was, I'm sorry, that still wasn't audible.
Oh, this is Stephanie, Lara, and Andrea Candelaria from the Cahuilla tribe.
Thank you. Next, please. Thank you. Right here.
The river. That's how my son went to school.
It seems some people are having problems with their mic phone. So we have Nathan Rich from Hoshea Band of Homo Indians.
Nathan Rich, we have you listed. Thank you. From Kashaya.
Shia, sorry. We have Andrea Candelaria.
Yes, Andrea Candelaria and Stephanie Laura have checked in from the Cahuilla tribe.
Brenda Tamara from
Lighton Band.
yes.
Hi, Brenda. We have you listed here from the Lighton Band.
Ethan Lawton. Ethan Lawton. Maybe yeah, you can read. Sorry.
Great. And then representing Ethan Lawson, we have you on the webinar. Thank you. And I also like to acknowledge Natalie Forrest Perez from the Pit River Tribe. Are you the current TIPO, Natalie? Okay. Great. She's muted. All right.
Yes.
And then we'll go. Thank you, Natalie. And we have Susan Studer. And I see. I'm not sure which tribe you're with, Susan.
She's so cool.
Okay.
Susan is with Pit River as well.
Okay, thank you. We have Javier Tito Cervantes. He's our tribal liaison out of our Reading office. Is that all? Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tito. Thank you all for taking the time to be on the phone. As part of the group that we have here, we have Kamyar and Paul and Francisco and Wa, and we're going to take a review and I think you've had a chance to take a look at the water plan. They're going to discuss the overview, the reviewer's guide, and go through each of the chapters. And we'd like to also, have time for discussion from that tribal perspective. I do want to make a quick announcement for everybody on the line is that under our new governor's administration, we do have a new Secretary of Natural Resources, and Wade Crowfoot has been appointed as Secretary of Natural Resources, replacing Secretary John Laird. And I have worked with Wade Crowfoot. He has worked very diligently and hard under Governor Brown's administration. He was in charge of the Drought Task Force, and so there's been some really good relationships built. I'm hoping that we'll see that continued relationship building with him as Secretary of Natural Resources. So with that, go ahead, Kamyar, and I'll leave it to you to, we'll start with this agenda that's set up.
Okay. Thank you, Anacita, and thank you, everyone, for participating on today's webinar. We know you're extremely busy, and we appreciate you taking the time to help us finalize the update 2018 of the California Water Plan. I wanted to just note that what we're going to be talking about today is really the culmination of nearly 3 years of work, and that includes with agencies, California Native American tribes, a number and very broad spectrum of stakeholders and other technical experts, plus a significant set of resources here at the Department of Water Resources. Okay, we apologize for the technical difficulties. We lost the sound momentarily here in Sacramento, so I'm going to maybe repeat just a few items in case you missed it. As I was talking about the plenary meeting and the subsequent Tribal Advisory Committee webinar to go over the content of Update 2018 of the Water Plan. And at the time, the public review draft was not ready or available for discussion. Today, we do have the public review draft, and we will be walking through the entire plan to give you a brief overview of its content. And at the end of the day, our purpose is to make sure the public and tribes and stakeholders understand what's in the plan and provide a context for getting another and final round of public comment before we finalize the water plan. So just to explain briefly why the public review draft the release of it was delayed, as you know, we got a new director, Carla Namath, just a year ago, and subsequent to that, a number of our deputy directors were also changed. Some retired and some changed positions. As a consequence, we felt it necessary to take some additional time to brief them and orient them on the content of Update 2018, because the importance of the plan is not just preparing it, but its implementation. And it's very important to have DWR executive, the Natural Resources Agency, familiar and supportive of the content of the plan. There were also some changes in Natural Resources Agency, and we wanted to make sure that they were fully apprised of what's in the water plan. We released the public review draft on the 20th of December, and we scheduled a 30-day comment period, which ends on January 21st, which is actually a holiday, but we will be taking comments through the end of that day. And starting the 22nd, the DWR team will, well, actually, even before as comments come in, we are reviewing and organizing the content by the topics and providing that to the various subject matter experts for them to understand the comment and recommend potential changes to the public review draft. One of the other significant changes that you'll notice in this draft relative to the draft that we shared about a year ago is that there's less detail. For instance, the implementation plan chapter has been removed. And the motivation for this is that given that it took later than expected to put out the public review draft and finalize the water plan, and we are now in the midst of a transition from the Brown administration to the Newsom administration. DWR executive and agency felt that it would be prudent to put out a plan that is not too prescriptive and provide opportunity to engage the new administration on working out those implementation details. However, as you go through, if you wanted to take the time to compare the January 28th version to the December 2018 version, what you'll notice is much of the shortening is a distillation rather than a weakening of the water plan update. There's a very strong framework based on the foundation of managing water resources for sustainability, and that is still very much alive in the current public review draft. We're on an expedited schedule now that the PRD is out to get out the final water plan. And once the comment deadline finishes, starting the 22nd, the water plan team will be working expeditiously to review, organize, and incorporate the comments into the final water plan for approval by DWR executive and the Natural Resources Agency. So with that, what I'd like to do is just briefly go over a few PowerPoint slides to give you the overarching narrative that we want to convey and advance in this update. And then Paul Macera will walk you through the various chapters of the water plan in greater detail. And we're providing sufficient time for you to ask questions of clarification as well as to make comments. So whatever comments you make today are also being recorded and are being considered as part of the comment period. So the focus and features of this update of the water plan is, like all strategic plans, to get grounded in what is the current state of affairs, what has been accomplished since the last water plan update, and what are the challenges and drivers of change that we are still grappling with. As I mentioned, sustainability is a main emphasis of this water plan update, and for that reason, we wanted to take some time to work on what is meant by sustainability when it comes to water resource management. The recommendations in Chapter 3 are prioritized. We're now down to 19. Update 2013 had over 350 recommendations. So we, I think, have stayed true to our word of making Update 2018 more focused and prioritized with the intent of driving action and really getting the attention and support by the legislature and the administration. As part of that understanding sustainability, this update of the water plan includes a tool that we call the Sustainability Outlook, and it is basically a matrix of values, societal values, outcomes, and indicators. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in a minute. And then for the first time, this water plan update, in addition to having recommendations, we have estimated the cost to implement those recommendations, not just in the near term, but over the next 50 years. And we also have explored and presented a few funding scenarios to show how the funding, the revenues could be generated to pay for those actions. So Paul Massaro will walk you through the four major or the four key chapters of the water plan update. They're here on the slide. I won't read them to you, and you'll get more details from Paul. I also wanted to note at the bottom of the slide is that this water plan update, while being less than 50 pages, is based on a lot of work. And that additional work is documented in 15 and probably a few more supporting documents, plus 45 companion state plans that we had considered and taken information from working with the 30 state agency steering committee. So one of the fundamental drivers that we advance in this update is that California is more and more about a tale of extremes. We are a Mediterranean climate, so that in and of itself results in hydrology and precipitation events that are rarely average. We often are on the dry side and the wet side, and the timeline on this slide shows there are even years when we have both droughts and floods. And climate change is making those extremes more pronounced, more consequential, and really changing some of the foundational thinking behind how California has developed and managed its water infrastructure and systems. Snowpack changes and snowmelt dynamics is just one of those significant changes that are occurring. The Chapter 3 in the water plan includes a conditions assessment and describes the most consequential drought in our history, as well as in 2017, the second wettest year on record. In keeping with prior water plan updates, we have added to the water balances through water year 2015. So we now have a data set from 1998 to 2015 of the water uses and the water supplies in California at various spatial detail. We also describe the accomplishments that have occurred under the Governor's Water Action Plan and other related state actions, as well as the funding that has driven a lot of those changes from Propositions 1 and now 68. In the water plan, we also wanted to underscore the history of how money has been spent in investments for water. And one of the big points to make is that the state government has been expending on average about $2 billion per year on water management. That includes flood management, water supply, water quality, ecosystem management, wastewater treatment and management. That amount is only 2% of the entire state general fund. Only 2%. And so that is in itself a commentary, perhaps, of how Californians have and have valued water in society. The other important point is that 80% of all the money that has been and is being spent on water is at the local and regional level. And there are plots, charts in the water plan that demonstrate that. The other thing it demonstrates that most of that expenditure, 3/4, has been for operations, maintenance, planning, and ongoing costs, not the upfront capital costs. And the bonds and other state efforts often focus on the capital expenditures, not the ongoing. We also, based on work that has been done, estimate that over the next 50 years, there is at least a shortfall of $350 billion of investment backlog for water infrastructure and management systems in California. You will read in a concise fashion some of the key challenges that we're still grappling with. You see them here on the slide. We also wanted to spend some particular time describing a few systemic and institutional challenges that are making the resolution or how to address those other challenges more difficult. And those are that California water governance and decision-making and planning is highly decentralized. Over 2,300 entities manage different aspects of water in California. Some of those entities also have regulatory responsibilities, and that has resulted in regulations that are very specific, specialized, yet at times not consistent and even conflicting amongst the various agencies, state and federal, when it comes to water management. We also recognize that to do better integrated water management, we're going to need better information and data to drive more holistic decision-making than we have at current. And that the funding we have had, even though it's considerable, is still insufficient and unstable to address these challenges. And then one of the other things we notice is that it's one thing to spend money, it's another to demonstrate what we get for that investment. And so we have to do a better job of tracking performance in our water management systems. So to be sustainable, the water plan asserts that we need to work on getting more shared intent and outcomes. We have to set goals for the long term. This is something that comes naturally to California Native American tribes, and working with tribes over the last decade has really helped make this point in the California Water Plan. We need to do a better job of aligning the various sectors of water management and to integrate the work that we're doing on watershed, groundwater basin, and regional scales. And we have to make sure that those investments are consistent with what society is telling the state are their values. I mentioned that we have to also be able to track and adapt to demonstrate that consistency, and that at the end of the day, working towards sustainability It's a journey, not a destination, and that takes time and commitment, and we have to give ourselves permission to make mistakes because we don't have perfect foresight, and to adapt our planning and management moving forward. So this update of the water plan advances 6 sustainability goals and roughly 19 or 20 recommended actions to overcome the challenges, as well as the critical challenges, as well as the systemic and institutional challenges. One is to improve integrated watershed management. And when you look at the water plan update draft, as part of the executive summary, we have included a summary table that shows these 6 goals that I'm going to go over, plus the recommended actions under each goal. Goals 2 and 3 really go together. One is to note that we need to strengthen the resiliency and flexibility of our water infrastructure and operations, and we have to do that in a way that works to restore our critical ecosystem functions. We also have to make sure that we take actions that empower underrepresented and vulnerable communities throughout California. We really have to hit home that there are millions of Californians in a state which is the 5th largest economy in the world that do not have safe drinking water and or sanitation. And we have to, as a state, continue to work on improving that. We also, in working on those institutional challenges, have to take actions to improve agency alignment and to address these persistent regulatory challenges, and then take actions to develop the information and that can support our decision-making going forward. This flower demonstrates the key, the outer petals, the key sectors of water management in California, and historically, the actions we've taken are on the periphery of these petals, focused where there's very little or no overlap amongst sectors. To be sustainable, we have to work toward the center of this flower, where there's more and more overlap amongst the sectors. And this is really what we mean by integrated watershed management, where we get multiple sectors collaborating, working across disciplines as we do our planning on multi-benefit projects, and then actually knit together pots of money from each of these various sectors toward common projects and programs. So in this update of the water plan, we estimate that those 19 recommended actions will require $90 billion of state funding over the next 50 years. Of that $90 billion, 86% would be for cost-sharing local and regional infrastructure projects and ecosystem projects, both capital and ongoing operations and maintenance. About 10%, or $9.7 billion, would be for improving state projects and ecosystem infrastructure and ecosystem projects, and only 3%, or $2.7 billion, is needed to help overcome many of those systemic and institutional challenges. And those are the reddish tone expenditures at the very bottom of this bar chart. And again, what we have to demonstrate to people of Californians is that those expenditures will help improve public health and safety, provide for ecosystem vitality, a healthy economy, and enriching experiences, which includes certainly recreation, but also societal and even religious uses of water. So this sustainability approach requires that we take action, track what we're doing, adapt where it's not working, improve our plans for the next cycle, and then go to another cycle of action. And in the water plan, we lay out the sustainability outlook to demonstrate how we can track our return on investment. So here's an example. So one of the public values is, or societal values, is public health and safety. One in the outcome that we're looking for is adequate water supply for domestic needs, sanitation, and fire suppression. And one indicator that can help us track that outcome is the number of public water systems not in compliance with drinking water standards. So one of the supporting documents, or actually two of the supporting documents of the water plan, lay out the sustainability outlook, which includes 4 societal values, about a dozen outcomes, and 3 dozen indicators. And we have, in this cycle of the water plan, just scratched the surface of trying to demonstrate or test out how these values, outcomes, and indicators could work on a regional scale or a watershed scale. We've done some work with the Santa Ana watershed and in the Russian River watershed. We've also done work with the Pacific Institute on how corporations are beginning and need to incorporate sustainability outcomes and indicators in the work that they do. So going forward, we want to advance these 6 goals of sustainability. We want to implement the 19 or 20 recommended actions, use the sustainability outlook to track how well we're doing, and then advance the investment strategy to the legislature and the new administration with funding scenarios for how we could actually get that work done. So we do have the water plan website, and all of the content that we're discussing today is posted there. And then we do have the water plan e-news, which I know many of you subscribe to. So with that, we could take some comments or questions, but what I will assure you is that Paul Macera is going to get into more details on each of the 4 chapters.
Thank you, Kamir. And I just, for those of you on the webinar, I don't know if we mentioned it, but you can send Francisco a note when you do have a question. And again, we've allocated some time to take a pause as I step through this to answer questions or receive comments for that matter as well. So what I'd like to offer you today is a pretty quick walkthrough of the document itself. So we won't get into a great deal of detail, but I would like, I hope that the outcome of this is really that you're fairly well oriented with the type of content in the plan, and hopefully we can kind of along the way flag stuff that is most pertinent to your interests and most pertinent to the type of feedback that we're actually soliciting on this public review draft.
Just come here. Just before we jump into Chapter 1, Francisco, could you just show the reviewer's guide on the inside back cover or front cover, just so participants in the webinar know where they can go to get that information. So, yeah, go ahead, Francisco.
So, the reviewer's guide is on the inside back of the document. You can find the document on our website, on the water plan website, and you can find all of the content for the water plan PRD under the water plan updates page. Let's give a second. So the PRD is posted. You can find the main document, the executive summary, and the fact sheet. The Water Plan Update 2018 is also composed of supporting documents, as Camille mentioned, and the ones that we have available are posted here. And in the coming weeks, we will post the remaining documents. We have also been receiving public comments, which are available as well. So if you have sent us comments and you do not see them here, please let us know, and we will find them and post them. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. If I could trouble you to flip back to Chapter 1. What I'd like to do before delving into the content is just kind of give you an overview of this chapter prior to a brief walkthrough. And so what this chapter is intended to do, and again, this is something that we would like to receive your feedback on if it does not accomplish the intent, if this chapter doesn't do its job. And so the job of this chapter is to really provide a common frame of reference for the readers and for resource managers and elected officials in terms of recent activities and also in terms of current and ongoing activities and water management. So that frame of reference is useful, and I'll tie it into the next chapter when we get there. But suffice it to say, that's the job of this chapter. It's comprised of 3 pieces, and before I do the walkthrough, I'll just call them out so you get kind of oriented with the flow of information. So first of all, it takes stock of the kind of where we are now and what we've been doing. So state initiatives. It also lays out the water uses and supplies, describes how we've been using water and where the supply sources have been coming from. And then lastly, it describes and provides data regarding what we've been paying for and who's been paying for it, so historical funding as well. So on page 1 here, as we flagged there, state initiatives and investments. If you could just scroll through, I won't read through the list, but there's I believe a dozen or so initiatives that have been described in this chapter. We'd be interested to know if you have any thoughts on anything that we may want to include here that's missing. It's not meant to be all-inclusive, but it is meant to kind of provide the highlights of what the state has been involved in as of recent. And you can see it goes beyond DWR. That also includes the water boards and other state agencies. And then, of course, we've described the bonds that have passed since the prior water plan update of 2013. So, and the point here of the state initiatives is really part of it is kind of a bit of an accomplishment report. Let's see what we've done. And then part of it is to just, again, as I said, frame up what else needs to be done going forward. So the next section is, as I mentioned, the water supply and uses. So these are what we call the water balances. And if I could trouble you to scroll down to the first graphic, the first figure, it's pretty dense, but has a lot of, I think, useful information. And it's for water years 2011 through 2015. And by the way, we had an update, prior updates. I think we started in 1998 with actual water data of where water is used and what and the supply sources. Now we have a pretty good data set from 1998 through 2015, and our intent as a core piece of the water plan is to continue doing this going forward. Obviously, the value increases as the amount of data increases and the time history available. But what's noteworthy here, a couple things. So on the top row, that shows the water year. Next row, it shows the water year type, percent of average annual rainfall. And you can see the variation. You can see when the drought starts in 2012 and continues through 2016, I believe. We don't have the data yet prepared for 2016. But you can. This actually gives us some real insights in terms of kind of who takes the hit during the drought in terms of these water use sectors on the left-hand column, and then also when we get into the supplies, what happens to the supplies? How do they shift? So that's kind of the story that this tells. And down in the supplies, I mean, particularly noteworthy is looking at the shift in groundwater use during drought. That's a biggie. Obviously, that's a big part of why we have and continue to implement the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, for example. It's really, groundwater has been a major go-to source during dry periods, and obviously there's a huge initiative to try to balance out our groundwater aquifers. This data helps frame that problem quantitatively. So I think it's really insightful. The relational aspects of this I would encourage you to kind of take away your own analysis and comparisons and look at the data. And the next figure, these are important too, the next two figures. So this is a wet year, so this is 2011, and it's arrayed by the regions. And the reason why I say this is important is because you can see the variability in the types of uses. Under the applied water use, that's the top bar, and the supply sources. And look at the variability not only in the size of the bars, so the magnitude of water in play, but also the different colorations, so the different uses and supplies. It tells a really interesting story. And one big takeaway that I like to mention in this is that for a state as big and diverse as California, really one size does not fit all in terms of the management strategies that work for each region, because each region has its own challenges and its own different sets of opportunities that can be leveraged. So that's the story told here. And then there's, of course, a comparison for this wet year, and then the next one is a dry year, just to show the variability across water year types. So those are the water supplies and uses. And then lastly, in this chapter, we've, as I said, quantified historical investment. This is also an important story because it shows quantitatively that the state invests, federal government invests, local and regional entities invest, but look at the, well, we're not quite there yet, but the proportionality is very different in terms of who's paying for what. So this first one breaks it out by capital investment and ongoing investment. That includes operations and maintenance, planning, data, those types of things, and ongoing. Capital, of course, is the kind of large magnitude, short duration investments in infrastructure and things like ecosystem restoration. But the next graph, in terms of capital expenditures broken out by state, federal, and local, this is where it gets, I think, really interesting, showing the relative contributions. So the state has typically invested up to $2 billion annually. The federal government is under $1 billion, with a B, billion. And then local is generally about 85% of the total investment comes from local sources. And that's important in our story. It's important to know going forward because that really was used to help define our spending recommendations in the water plan. We're suggesting we carry forward that proportionality. We're not suggesting the state spend 50% of the total expenditures. We're suggesting that this proportion be carried forward because it actually has worked in the past. Most projects are local and locally derived funding is appropriate. But interesting fact that might be non-intuitive, particularly for some of our state agency folks. That so the next one shows ongoing expenditures. Again, locals paying for most of it, state and federal paying for a relatively smaller portion. So that's chapter 1. Again, just kind of providing the frame of reference, where we've been recently and where we are today. And so to elaborate on that, chapter 2 actually focuses. So the job, I mentioned the job of chapter 1, providing that frame of reference. The job of chapter 2 is really to tell the story about what we're up against in the way of challenges to becoming more sustainable in the future. And so I'll describe those in a moment. I just want to make sure it's clear that what we're intending to do with this chapter, and hopefully hear from you all if we're not accomplishing it as well as we can. But before I get into the challenges, I just want to note one thing that's really important, and Kamiar alluded to it in his presentation, and that is we've developed what we view as a common and comprehensive description of sustainability. Frankly, in my opinion, the word sustainability has been used for a long time as kind of describing an ideal. And now, the way that's framed up in the water plan, we are suggesting we have a framework for actually designing policy intended to become more sustainable and tracking progress, telling us whether we're becoming more sustainable. So I view this as a giant step forward in accomplishing the ideal or the aspirational notion of becoming more sustainable. And so the box there, I won't read it to you, but it does contain the 4 societal values that Kamiar already talked about. Those are core to describing what sustainability is. And then, of course, we unpack it in the sustainability outlook like Kamiar showed to make sure that it's an actionable framework towards sustainability. So getting into the challenges, Kamiar talked about the two categories of challenges. One is the critical. I call those kind of a little more tangible: groundwater overdraft, changing water demands, drought, flood, things that we've all experienced recently. And yeah, just scrolling through it is probably fine at this point. Declining groundwater levels, some pretty alarming numbers there. Declining ecosystems, more than 150 listed species as threatened or endangered in California. And you know, one thing worth noting under declining ecosystems too, it's a little bit of a value judgment, but it's actually, I think, a pretty defensible observation that funding for ecosystems has not been on par with funding that we as Californians have given for things like water supply, water reliability, wastewater treatment. That's a pretty, relatively speaking, a pretty stably funded sector. Ecosystem, same for flood, is not particularly stably funded. And those types of activities, flood management, ecosystem restoration, protecting vulnerable communities, those are things that the state government is mostly on the hook for actually accomplishing. So it's kind of a twofer. Things that are well funded tend to be things that are administered locally. Things that haven't been particularly well funded oftentimes fall under the purview of state government. So water quality degradation, there's delta conflicts. Don't go into a lot of detail because there are processes occurring focused on the delta, and we don't litigate or re-examine those issues within the water plan. Rather we reference those dedicated programs that are occurring. Headwaters and forests, those are important, and that's oddly enough relatively new to water planning circles. I think over the last 10 years we've been bringing that conversation into the water plan. I think it's gaining more traction. I think we continue to make the case that this is important for watershed sustainability, the headwater health and the forests that occur within the headwaters. So with the tree die-off, we kind of note that as one of the challenges and the impacts associated with that for water managers and the beneficiaries of the state's water resources. So similarly with catastrophic wildfires, we've brought that into the conversation over the last 10 years. Unfortunately, we do have some really startling data that we were able to bring into this water plan to underscore the intensity of this challenge, the urgency in addressing it, and the relevance to watershed management. Changes in water demand, pulling forward some information from Update 2013. So those are the critical challenges, and by the way, these represent a pared down list. This isn't every challenge imaginable. There's obviously many, many dozen challenges, particularly when you get into it at a local regional scale. What this is, however, are the most pressing challenges that help set the stage for what Kamiar described in Chapter 3 as the recommendations, which are priorities for state government. So most pressing challenges lay the foundation for the state's priorities, which I'll describe here shortly in Chapter 3. The systemic and institutional challenges, these are important from a strategic standpoint, very, very important, because we are in many ways impeded from effectively addressing those critical challenges over and over again. Why do we keep experiencing the same drought impacts, for example? We will always have dry periods. The drought impacts don't have to be the same, though, if we are able to more effectively manage going forward. So these are the things that impede our ability, for example, to reduce drought impacts during future dry periods. I'm not saying nothing's being done, but I am saying we can do more, and we can do more effectively and efficiently. So another example, too, if we align our governance and we align our initiatives, we can do more together. We're all planning within a connected system. Let's all connect ourselves within that system and all pull in the same direction to accomplish a shared vision. Regulations, there's a lot of challenges with that. Regulations serve a valid purpose. At the same time, there's opportunity potentially to improve the outcomes by modifying the way that we regulate. Data, I think we've all been in a position many, many times where we have desired more information or data before making critical decisions, critical and urgent decisions. And not only that, but tracking whether our decisions actually achieved the desired outcomes. So this insufficient capacity for data-driven decision-making is intended to address that. And with water being so complex and so interconnected and so dynamic, this is absolutely imperative that we develop a more robust data set and more tools to help us understand current conditions and help us look into the future. Insufficient and unstable funding, Camille talked about that a little bit. I won't go into too much detail, but we do have recommendations in that vein, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Performance tracking, we talked about that as well. We can't effectively manage what we can't effectively track in most cases. So, and lastly, we conclude Chapter 2 with a brief description of the sustainability outlook that Camille talked about. He showed that unpacking of, in this case, the sample's societal value was public health and safety. That's, I think, as good a glimpse as any into what the sustainability outlook will do. And then you can just imagine, kind of extrapolate that out for the other three societal values. It's a really good start at a very well organized approach for tracking progress. And our intent, well, you'll see when we talk about recommendations on what we expect we can do with this going forward. So that's all for Chapter 2. I would suggest maybe, I don't know if we've had any questions, but maybe pausing and seeing if there are any before we get into Chapters 3 and 4. Chapters 1 and 2 kind of set the stage for the recommendations and funding.
If you have any questions, please send it to us via chat, or I'm happy to open your mic.
So far. Okay. Well, let's jump into Chapter 3, and then we'll have another Q&A session at the end of all 4 chapters. So this isn't the only opportunity to engage, but we would definitely invite your input. And that's what we're here for, is to hear from you. So having set the context for California water today and the challenges that we're up against, let's talk about what we think we can do about it and what we recommend doing about it. And just for context, there's a few things here that are important. When I say what we can do about it, the actions in Chapter 3 are designed for state government. These are the things that state government can, in some cases we suggest should do, to help manage those 2 types of challenges we just talked about. And so the job of this chapter is really what can we do as a state to support local activities in pursuit of the goals, which I'll talk about here in a minute, and ultimately in pursuit of a more sustainable water future. The second thing that's important context here is that the water plan doesn't create or authorize funding or enable certain mandates. So really a lot of this is contingent upon receiving the funding. So there's an important step between finalizing the water plan and making it happen, and that is the legislature, the governor's administration need to authorize and fund these actions in order for them to come to fruition. So that's important to know, and that's an important role potentially for all of us. We can't advocate for funding as a state agency, but the more our stakeholders can get behind this report, the more probability that it can actually be implemented. And that's why we want to hear from you all as to how we can make this most relevant. One more thing about context on this chapter before we get into the actions is that it's important to acknowledge that, again, these are for state government. There are unique roles that the state plays. Sometimes when we interact at a local and regional scale, local and regional entities might say, well, we got that covered. You know, what do we need the state for other than cost sharing? You know, we've heard that in conversations on where we go with integrated regional water management. At the same time, there are unique roles that the state is responsible for, that the state can do perhaps more efficiently, like things of economy of scale, like interregional projects, state water project, for example, state plan of flood control. So that's why we're recommending that the state implement these actions, because the state does have unique roles that can generally not be accomplished at a local or regional scale. And we're suggesting that local and regionals can help accomplish it, but the state needs to provide the incentives and leadership and guidance in making that happen. All right, so goal 1, so the actions are arranged by the goals that Camille talked about. And so each of these actions are designed to advance their respective goals. So I flagged a couple here. I wasn't going to go through all 19, but there are some that are particularly important for us today to be aware of. So right off the bat, recommendation 1.1, address water management needs for vulnerable communities. This involves, and this has been a conversation for some time, this is nothing new in terms of the concept. It would be new if we could accomplish it, and that is baseline funding for integrated regional water management groups to engage with tribes and vulnerable communities. So this is huge, and it's important, and that's why it's on here as one of the 19 priorities for state government. And again, there's a funding stream associated with this, and we'll get into chapter funding in Chapter 4. Working landscapes is important. There's been a lot of activity on this with California Forward. I know some work in the Delta has occurred. We're suggesting it's valuable and and the state should continue to pursue and support working landscapes activities. Promote flood managed aquifer recharge. Doug alluded to this a little bit earlier, but this is important. We can manage our system in a more integrated way, and this is one very obvious integrated water management opportunity that has untapped potential. So moving on to the next goal, number 2, this is all about infrastructure. And Action 2.1 is also a big deal because it involves a significant chunk of the recommended investment, and it involves a significant chunk for regional and local assistance. So this would, the goal here is to improve infrastructure. That's the overarching point of recommendation 2.1. And that can be done for state-owned activities. So you saw the breakdown that kind of foreshadowed in Camille's presentation, maybe up to $10 billion for state activities and infrastructure, and then the lion's share up to $78 billion going towards local and regional entities. So this is a big one, improving infrastructure. The analog to that is goal 3, because we've time and again over the past 10 to 15 years have said we really need to couple our ecosystem management and restoration with our infrastructure improvement and management activities. This goal enables us to do that. And so addressing legacy impacts, those are impacts for which really the responsible party is no longer in existence, yet the impacts are there. Somebody has to deal with them. That's something that the state is squarely on the hook for, and we're recommending funding for that. But I want to spend a little more time on recommendation 3.2. So this involves a pot of money that will augment and enable local and regional entities to actually do more multi-benefit projects. And what we mean by that is, in many cases, local jurisdictions, flood districts, water supply agencies, their funding authorizations don't allow them in many cases to do multi-benefit, to invest in ecosystem restoration. This pot of money would allow us to, I don't want to use the word too simple, to say both, but to conjoin different types of activities where there's opportunities. So if you're building a water treatment plant, for example, and there's an opportunity to enhance the treatment technologies such that it can enhance water quality beyond regulation, there could be an opportunity, another pot of money to help accomplish that. Or if you're restoring a levee, can you also enhance ecosystem or wetlands in association with that? So those are the types of things that a lot of money is used for. And then 3.3, that is just trying to find a consistent way to articulate and quantify the value of our ecosystem, in particular the services it provides, things like water quality enhancements, for example, of Sierra wetlands, that type of thing. There's been no real consistent method for quantifying that, and that's an important piece of information. Remember, I was suggesting we never seem to have all the information we need. This would be a really useful addition to our understanding of the value of ecosystems when we talk about implementing all of these things. Goal 4, this is a couple of things too, particularly relevant for us today. So one is to improve tribal involvement in regional planning, and it's kind of a companion to recommendation 1.1. So with the Tribal Advisory Committee and our State Agency Steering Committee, bringing those resources and knowledge to bear and to improve engagement with tribes so that we can have a more robust representation of tribes with these water management planning activities, and I would say in making the key decisions for implementing the water plan as well. And again, each of these has a proposed funding stream associated with it to better enable us to do that. So action 4.2, this involves liaisons. There are a couple in state service, I believe in the water boards, and these liaisons are tasked with engaging vulnerable communities, and in particular or specifically it's to provide technical, in some cases managerial, and also some cases financial expertise, for instance helping prepare proposals, grant proposals, that type of thing, but also just providing facilitation, empowering the vulnerable communities to have a bigger voice in water management. So this is also important. And we're not talking about just leveraging existing. There's also a reference here to support additional liaisons. Did you want to sign up?
Paul, thank you. This is Anasita speaking. Before we go to goal 5, I wanted to bring up two items that have been brought to my attention by tribal representatives informally. And I have not seen written public comments. And without having the written public comments, we would not be informed as a department to make some substantive changes. And I wanted to bring, if you could go back to page 3-1, Francisco, to recommended action 1.2. So one of the questions I received was, what is the role of a working landscape? And for tribes, when they're talking about landscapes, they're talking about cultural landscapes. So one of the comments informally was a request of, can we look at this definition of working landscapes, or does DWR actually consider working landscapes to include cultural landscapes? Because that's very much foremost for tribes. And then when we're talking about working landscape stewardship programs, the other question from tribes was, how is there a possibility in the water plan to include with these sustainable actions of tribal ecological knowledge as an ability to help with the sustainability stewardship? So that was, and I thought maybe in recommended action 1.2 might be a good place for that. And then the other comment area, if we would go to page 3-2 to recommended action 3.3, and we're quantifying natural capital. And that was also another area when we're talking about ecosystems of how then do we have that holistic approach that has been brought up at various tribal meetings. So my question to the tribal participants, and I've asked people, these are areas I think that our water plan would benefit from your comments and input on. In my point of view, these might be good places where we could add a couple of sentences that would be inclusive of that. And so those are the things I wanted to bring up to our tribal group on the phone. And then the other, of course, as Paul mentioned, making sure that the recommended actions 4.1 and 4.2, the language as it exists is strong enough and reflective enough of these tribal perspectives. So I'd like to either let Paul continue unless someone on the phone wants to address that right now, but I wanted to bring that to the attention to our tribal audience, and then have Paul go into goal 5 and 6.
Okay.
So we'll take a quick pause in case anyone raised their hands. Otherwise, I'll let Paul go forward, and then we can circle back to those comments I raised.
This Kamyar. So as we go over, when we cover goal 6, which is about data and information, that may be another place to emphasize tribal ecological knowledge.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Again, if you would like to speak, just send us a chat or raise your hand. Oh, there you go. Okay. Go ahead. Donna.
We have a comment from someone on the phone. I believe your mic's been opened.
You might be muted on the other end.
We're not hearing you.
Donna, your mic is
I apologize, Donna, if you're speaking, we don't hear you. She just sent a comment.
Okay.
So, Donna, we'll get back to you, and we'll let Paul continue on with goals 5 and 6. Thank you, Donna.
And again, you can send a note to Francisco if that may be the better form of communication at this time. All right, so goal 5, this is, I talked about it earlier in the simplest of terms. It's making sure that we're all working together and pulling in the same direction, because we're all working within interconnected systems. That's kind of what this is about, including how we regulate. And so 5.1 is explicitly calling out more recognition for the ecosystem needs when we talk about infrastructure. This helps clarify too what we can do with the funding that's proposed that I talked about earlier for infrastructure and ecosystems. And this also references a particular existing construct that lets us, that does improve our ability to plan for ecosystem needs, and that's AB 2087, which authorizes regional conservation investment strategies. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but just be aware that that exists, and it's a tool that is probably underutilized, is what we hear from Fish and Wildlife. Okay, the next one, streamlining ecosystem project permitting. So the point here is, if we're all in agreement that we're doing something that has a net benefit to the environment, is there a way that we can actually streamline the permit? Because it's just, so that, I think that speaks for itself, the logic behind that. And so 5.3, other regulatory challenges, like regulating to a specific species without particular regard for broader habitats and restoration needs, or for example, regulating or requiring mitigation for specific projects in kind of a piecemeal way, isn't probably as integrated as we would like to see in terms of integrated water management. So that's what that's all about. Let's look at opportunities to improve that. And yes, that does involve bringing in potentially statutes and changes in statutes and so on. So goal 6, we kind of set this up with the institutional and systemic challenge of the lack of data and tools and our ability to adaptively plan and manage. What this would do, this goal in a nutshell, would really enhance our confidence that what we do will work. That's the way I kind of like to describe this goal. We will know more information going into an action or an investment, and we'll have a better ability on the back end to track whether or not it worked. And that's the information we need to adapt. So if you recall that curly cue that Gamir talked about, this definitely reinforces our ability to do that. And so there's data, there's implementation of AB 1755, which is more open and transparent data and sharing of data. That's huge. So climate change, making sure that we're coordinating and talking about the same thing in terms of the expected impacts, so we can have a solid understanding and plan and preparedness for mitigating those impacts going forward.
And if I can interrupt you for a moment, Paul, this is Anasuka speaking. Another comment that was informal as to recommended action 6.1 is that the data sets, we sort of define it as ecological data sets, but those data sets could be more inclusive, and hopefully with the tribal advisory committee's support in ongoing efforts, that we define the data sets also to include, tribal documents and information that would assist tribes as well. And that's something that's going to be new, especially given what we're doing with groundwater planning and the groundwater sustainable plans and that data set managing. But I wanted to just point that out to the tribal community, that when we're talking about these data sets, I look at that as beyond just the data and hydrology and geography mapping data. It could also be other types of data sets. And then, of course, the caveat, of course, with that we always will respect cultural and sensitive sites in terms of any public data.
Well, those are great points. And I would just connect the dots too, where we talk about enhancing our ability to bring tribal perspectives into the planning process, and the other recommendations will complement this one as well. That's a good point. We're on action 6.3. Well, I kind of talked about the climate change. Yeah. 6.3, I kind of talked about already, but I do want to say this is a big deal. This is how we recommend. And again, we need to talk about this. Conversations are open for the incoming administration. We need to talk about specifics. But it's a big deal to aspire to have a good, consistent performance tracking capability. And that gets back to the sustainability outlook.
And I'll just, this Kamyar, just add to that in some recent conversations with tribes on the North Coast, we have offered to work with tribes to actually demonstrate and test the sustainability outlook on tribal land. So we are looking for tribes who are interested to work with us on that.
And I think it's important too, you know, a lot of these recommendations relate to each other, so that gets back to the data, right? The comprehensive data tracking and bringing in tribal ecological knowledge. It gets back to our ability to enhance our ability to coordinate with tribes. So this is all really connected in a big way. Recommendation 6.4, developing a regional water management atlas. This is the bottom line here, and this is also a big deal. It's been in the works for a long time. The intent has been in the works for a long time. A tool is emerging that can help us communicate better with local, regional, and tribal entities to better represent in the water plan what their priorities are, what all your priorities are, the types of actions that may best meet those priorities, the types of investment needs, getting a real handle on that. And it's not easy because of the vast array of different entities in the state, but it's important. Once we get our heads around what I just described, the priorities, the actions, the funding needs, we can roll it up into the water plan and help inform state policy. So we have some investment estimates that Kamyar talked about, up to $90 billion. When this tool is deployed, we can really sharpen those estimates, and we can be even more strategic and more effective at cost-sharing local and regional projects because we have a better handle on what's needed. That's important. Action 6.5, so we implement Action 6.3, we're able to actually track things better. It would make sense to have that as kind of a string attached to state funding. You know, there's been a lot of calls for the state being more accountable, more transparent, more clear about what we're investing in and what we're getting for it. This would enable us to do that. It would require that if somebody's receiving state funding, they would need to report out. You know, it's not onerous, but they would need to report out using the construct of the sustainability outlook. These are the outcomes we had. These are the outcomes we achieved, that type of thing. More so than, I think Kamyar mentioned it earlier, that goes way beyond our current ability to just report on how much we're spending, where we're spending it, and how fast we're spending it. So that doesn't get to the outcomes, obviously, so we want to enhance our ability to report out on outcomes. The next one, 6.6, that's expanding education. A lot of this is for succession, in a sense. So making sure that we have the multiple disciplines that we've recognized that need to be involved in effective water planning and management, making sure that our universities are offering the right courses of study and the right type of degrees, and then inspiring youth to actually get involved in water management in a way that can promote more sustainability in the future. A broader suite of disciplines and cross-disciplines for that matter. 6.7, this is the final recommendation of the 19, and obviously this goes without saying, it's also supremely important to develop ways to provide the funding necessary to do all this good stuff. So you'll see in Chapter 4, we generally rely on kind of current mechanisms to provide the funding. There are some limitations to those, and the funding required exceeds the funding available through current mechanisms. So this is meant to promote conversation about how can we augment and stabilize funding. And that's the end of Chapter 3. So the idea in Chapter 4 is how do we pay for all this?
Before we go on to Chapter 4, Donna has a question.
Go ahead, Donna.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah?
Sure can. Thank you.
Oh, great. Sorry about that. I was listening to my PC, and I don't have a mic on the PC. But anyway, yeah, Anacita, good comment in regards to tribal ecological knowledge and also the cultural landscapes. And I provided my comment, I believe, submitted that, and I think it was my comment number 6. It was in regards on page 3-2. I commented on goal number 4, the recommended action 4.1, where it talks about, I wanted to kind of change that description. I feel that Water Resources is doing a good job in outreaching to tribes. So my term was to expand the facilitation versus improve, because I think you guys are doing a good job. That's just my 2 cents there. But to elaborate on that particular recommended action 4.1, I'd like to have the sentence that I wrote is develop a better understanding of use of tribal ecological knowledge in regards to traditional uses of water, watershed management, ecological changes, protection of cultural resources and landscapes, and current day Native American tribes' uses and management of water. So I was hoping maybe something like that, which I think kind of hit both areas of what Anacita was talking about, is somewhere in there the incorporation of the evolution of understanding the concepts of TEK, and also the fact that we do need to be inclusive of cultural landscapes.
Thank you, Donna. I really appreciate that.
This Kamyar. So Donna and Anacita, if we could be pointed to some additional information about what is meant by cultural landscape, so that the water plant team has a better, this is not a term, and I want to make sure we understand what it meant, so that we know how to consider it as we're finalizing the water.
I don't know that I've seen a definition outside of the AB 52 legislation in terms of protecting cultural landscapes, and that was traditional cultural landscapes. It was TCL as a defined statutory definition, and so that was a different terminology that came about with AB 52. So we definitely want to reach out to the tribes that are on the phone and other tribal communities to get something that would be agreeable, because I think it is something, an opportunity now to use that term. For me, it's something that's a little bit more holistic than working landscapes, and that would be more inclusive of that tribal perspective. Anyone else that would like to weigh in on that?
I think another kind of understanding too of cultural landscapes is there was the prehistoric, historic views of where tribes were located and their uses, traditional uses and uses of water in those particular areas. And then there's the current day kind of definition of cultural landscapes of current presence of tribes where they're at today, and of course their existing watersheds and water sources, water systems that they have, and how that definition would blend in together. So I would also encourage outreaching to the Native American Heritage Commission on perhaps a broader definition that they have probably defined a bit with other tribes.
Thank you. I will initiate that outreach to Native American Heritage Commission, and if anyone already has tackled that, let me know.
I can only, like I said, for my tribe, kind of provide perspective of how we see our presence, because we're still there, currently present in the valley where we've always existed, unlike many tribes in California who have been relocated, migrated, moved out, forced out of their traditional landscapes. It's I think a bit of a challenge for them to, come up with a current day cultural landscape definition, but not speaking for them, but just saying that I would find it a challenge, but I think that they could definitely assist in this area.
Thanks.
This is Paul, that would be useful too, because it would help us clarify also the societal values. I mean, enriching opportunities, it's obviously much more than recreation. It includes the use of natural resources in a way that enriches, things like cultural and religious activities. So I think sharpening the definition there to include a cultural reference would be useful in illustrating one or more of the societal values. That's good.
Right, and this water plan would also kind of align with, the department that I work for, the Water Resource Control Board, because they have certainly been moving forward with working with tribes on defining cultural beneficial uses, which includes, I think, perspective of land uses as well.
Good.
That's a very good point. This is Anasita, because that is a definition that has been, in terms of the cultural beneficial use definitions, as well as the traditional cultural landscape definition as defined in AB 52. So we can start putting some of that together.
Okay.
I think we're ready to move on to Chapter 4. If there aren't any other questions or anyone's hands raised, I'll check in quickly with Francisco.
No.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paul. So we'll proceed with 4.
So we wrap up at 4. I want to make sure we have time for discussion. It's 3:24. I'll try to get through this relatively quickly. There's a lot here, but obviously it's available, the document, to get as much detail as you'd like. Quick orientation of the chapter. Starting, first of all, the job of this chapter really is to identify how we can pay for the implementation of the water plan. So the funding described here and the funding sources would be for state government activities. And again, a big part of that, it would be for state-provided local assistance. So yes, it would be funding and administered through the state, but a lot of this funding would be made available for local activities. So right up front, the bullet list talks about all the good things that are intended with the funding that's proposed in the water plan. So I won't read through the list, but there's a lot of good to be had, a lot of value to be had in actually accomplishing this investment strategy. But again, it requires authorization and funding from our elected officials in both branches of government. The scope and setting, I talked about that. These are for the state. This is for state government activities. Recommendations are intended to accomplish the state's obligations, roles, incentives, and so on. So then down below were some types of activities. I think I talked about this earlier, so I won't belabor it, but it's just important maybe to reinforce a little that some sectors are doing pretty well, some water sectors, namely those that actually are ratepayer-based revenue sources. We call out water supply and wastewater as an example. Others, not so much. And so, again, I think I mentioned this earlier, but just, again, reinforcing the fact that a lot of the things that the state is on the hook to do are a lot of things that aren't particularly stably funded. So that's the generalized point there. So moving on to the next page. Just for perspective and for context, it's worth noting that over the past 10 years or so, about 2% of the state's budget, so that includes state general fund, GEO bonds, and even the debt to pay back GEO bonds, about 2% is allocated to water resources. So that's just for perspective relative to other demands on state funding. Another thing we acknowledge, the second paragraph on this page, this is important because what we're saying here is we acknowledge and reaffirm our intent that locals tend to be best positioned to implement and manage their resources that occur within their jurisdictions, and reaffirm our intent that we are recommending providing the local assistance necessary to even empower them more, to equip them even more. I say them, local and regional entities, better equipped to actually manage things more actively and more sustainably. So we talked about the total cost of about $90 billion to implement all of the actions over the 50-year period, and about 3% of it, interestingly enough, going to the systemic challenges. And so if you recall that bar chart that Kamiar showed, and that kind of salmon-colored, that little sliver on the bottom of the bar chart, what we're suggesting is that investment, $2.7 billion, that's less than 3%, will optimize the rest of the $90 billion, and that will help ensure the maximum benefit from the rest of the $90 billion. So it's really important, and it's just a small fraction of the investment needed. And so that includes things like enhancing tribal engagement and the other institutional and systemic related recommendations. So funding mechanisms, what tools do we have at our disposal now, and what tools do we think we need to look at in the future? So by tools, I mean things like the State General Fund, State General Obligation Bonds. But before we jump into that, let me just briefly go over Table 4-1. So this lays out the funding needs by the goals and with respect to the 50-year time frame. So it has increments. The first two increments are 5-year increments, and then the next two columns are 20-year increments. And one thing to note about this is the years 1 through 5, there is a reasonable amount of certainty with these funding estimates. This is what we're kind of focusing on for Update 2018, because for 2023, we'll have a new plan which can address years 6 through 10. And again, with the Water Management Atlas, with better data, with better engagement, we can actually do better in that second column, years 6 through 10, in refining our priorities and the associated costs, and then the necessary funding mechanisms. So just recognizing that on the leftmost column, year 1 through 5, there's the most certainty, and then of course certainty becomes a little less as we progress out over the 50-year time frame. The point there is maybe not to hang our hats and argue about the 90 billion, but rather, is this on the right track, and can we agree that we need to re-examine and reprioritize in increments as we go forward. Oh, one more thing to note on this table is I said the majority of funding goes to goals 2 and 3, and this lays it out quantitatively, especially if you look out in the 50-year column, right? We have 60 billion for roughly 59 billion for goal 2. That was the infrastructure recommendation, and then 26.5 billion for ecosystem restoration, legacy impacts, that type of thing. And then the rest are, well, we went over that, but just seeing the distribution of the funding is actually, I think, something to be aware of. So getting back on the topic of funding mechanisms, I talked about State General Fund and General Obligation Funds. Those have been the two primary methods used as of recent. Each of them have their own benefits and constraints. There's other methods in place, like greenhouse gas cap and trade funds. There's user fees for some state agencies. These are less common, and they're less likely to help fund the implementation of the water plan, but we listed them anyway as some current mechanisms just to acknowledge that they exist. And then Table 4-2 shows the historical funding, the historical use and roles of these funding mechanisms. So you can see general fund, the top column, historical annual average, for example, has been 250 million, historical maximum, and the same with general obligation bonds, ranging from about 1.5 billion up to 2.3 billion, from average to maximum. There's a designated special fund. That's a big chunk of money, but again, those are already pre-allocated. So what we're not suggesting is reallocating existing funding streams, particularly when they're tied to things like user fees. That's not recommended in the plan, and it's legally challenging and just not advisable, because user fees are tied to a specific type of outcome and benefit. And then you can see the big chunk of local, historical investment, and federal. So those are the existing mechanisms and how they've been used as of recent, and the magnitudes from each one. If you scroll down, what we then do, thank you, let's go. Table 4.3 talks about attributes of these funds with respect to how can we use them going forward to implement the water plan. So that $90 billion. And this is particularly informative because it shows, for example, if you just take the general fund, state general fund, what it's saying is how much does it vary? The second column, interannual variability, how much does it vary year to year? The answer is quite a bit, so moderate. And because there's competing state interests, you know, it's unknowable on a year-by-year basis how much funding would be available for water management specifically. And then capital, generally the state general fund isn't that appropriate or I should say useful for funding these large chunks of capital. It's better for ongoing, things like O&M, where it's a smaller quantity, but it's a more stable and ongoing source of funding. So, and then the same is true for general obligation bond, same story, right? Is generally that is good for capital. You get these giant chunks of funding. It's good for investing and building things and restoring ecosystems. Not particularly good for where you depend on an annual cash flow. Geo bonds are unpredictable in that sense. So that's what this lays out. And the point here is that this helps us get our head around what are the best mechanisms for funding the various actions in the water plan. Because some are capital intensive, some are more ongoing. So that's existing mechanisms. Can you scroll down? So besides the current mechanisms, what else might we want to talk about? So this frames up a conversation about what we call novel. That means funding mechanisms that the state government hasn't particularly used in the past. So things like watershed assessments, potentially water surcharge. There's been a lot of talk about that, even some legislation initiated. Hasn't particularly gone forward, but I understand there's actually discussions are spooling up again on that in the legislature. So these are things that the state could potentially use but hasn't. And so table 4-4 is similar to 4-3 for the current mechanisms. This is for novel. So what might a watershed assessment be? How useful might that be? Interannual variability, it may vary annually. It actually could work for both capital and ongoing. So this lays out the attributes. And again, the big picture here is how do these mechanisms work with respect to the actions in the water plan. So if you could scroll, if I could trouble you to continue scrolling, please. So what we did is we looked at different combinations of funding mechanisms under different scenarios. So what I have highlighted there, scenario A is what if we emphasize borrowing as a way to pay for implementation of Update 2018, and this would be for general obligation bonds. Scenario B, what if we emphasize more of a pay-as-you-go using the state general fund and less borrowing? Scenario C is what if we look at kind of a combination of the two things? And there are findings for each of these scenarios, so if you can scroll, to the findings. If we assume that we're heavily dependent on general obligation bonds to fund implementation of the water plan, it's a significant jump. It would be more than double the rate of authorization of voter approval of general obligation bonds. So we'd have to double, so approaching $4 billion a year on average. So that's a huge chunk, and that's approximately, it's more than double, like I said, the rate of bond authorization. So we can talk about the feasibility of that. We don't particularly make that judgment. What we do is instead of recommending, we actually just queue up this information for elected officials to have in terms of what they want to do for funding policy and authorization. So scenario B is what if that's the pay-as-you-go. This is rather striking too, in that we would need over 8 times the historical state general fund appropriations to fully fund implementation of the water plan. That's with, I have to add, with a certain level, I think historical average level of GO bond authorization. So this is in addition to continuing our GO bonds on average, what we've done, plus 8 times the historical average of state general fund appropriations. It is worth noting, though, that it's 8 times the 2%, right? Because we talked earlier about 2% is what the state spends on average of the state budget on water management. So it's 8 times that. So again, we can draw our own conclusions and leave it up to the elected officials in terms of feasibility, the political and the palatability of these different scenarios. So scenario C, a blend, 5 times the historical average of the state general fund plus historical maximum GO bonds. I think that was about 2.6 billion a year. If I remember back to, I think it was table 4.1, showed historical maximum average GO bonds on an annual basis was about 2.6 billion. So sustaining the maximum plus general fund to pay for that 90 billion over the next 50 years would require 5 times the state general fund appropriation. So these are just some scenarios, again, not recommendations, but because it is kind of above our pay grade, it's the elected officials that need to make the decisions on funding authorizations and the types of mechanisms that will be brought to bear. And then we close out the entire plan with just a reaffirmation of the shared vision of the water plan. Very brief and to the point. We envision a better future in this way, and promote the authorization and funding required to make it happen.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you.
That was a quick walkthrough of the 4 chapters. Obviously, the supplemental information review is what is attached to the water plan. People can thumb through that, but I'd like to open it up for any open discussion. And some of you may are in the process of completing your public comments, so I appreciate the discussion raised earlier about what is helping us define cultural landscape and areas where we can be inclusive of tribal ecological knowledge. And then the other notation was on the data sets. I think that's an important area of interest to tribes. So are there any questions that are being submitted via email? Or I think we've unmuted all the mics on Francisco. So,
hello, this is Donna.
Yes, go ahead, Donna.
I had a question on table 4-2 on the historic funding. I noticed there was a line item for federal government funding. I'm wondering what's listed there. You have in a footnote federal government E. You have a footnote for item E there as far as what's included in that number for the federal government. But what I see missing is under would be U.S. Health and Human Services, Indian Health Services, that particular number, which would deal with water systems, wastewater treatment systems, scattered projects known as septic tanks, and then also the U.S. Department of Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs also has a hydrology area which goes out and helps tribes with the water well issues that are on tribal land. So, and then also, I don't know about U.S. HUD if they do anything as far as water-related systems for housing, but I just thought I'd throw that out there. So it can be a hard thing to try to obtain, but it's also something that could be added into the mix. And another thing is that in the state of California, we have several tribes that are doing economically well, and they're actually investing in their water systems, and that would be also a possible contribution to how we best manage our water in California. It's a more holistic view of it.
Very good points, Donna. Especially, I think it's well known that IHS and BIA's hydrology have been contributing to, water management and planning and infrastructure development on tribal lands. Good question on HUD. I'm thinking that yes, but I don't know exactly on how that's maintained or where that we can get that information. But if this purpose of this expanded footnote sub E is just is it more sort of just examples of where potential federal funding can come from?
No, it's historical. Where it came from.
Oh, okay.
It is a data poll. It should, can include what we just talked about.
Right. And then the comment about tribes that are investing, doing their self-investment as well, and that's federal monies.
Oh, I understand. What was the comment also referring to our quantification of local investment to make sure we capture the tribal investment?
And that could also be, I think it'd fall in both columns, local investment as well as on the federal side.
Okay.
Because the tribal income would be from federal as well as what they're investing on the local side.
Yeah. Okay.
And I can be corrected if that's a misstatement by any of our tribal representatives.
I think you're correct there, Anacita. I'm just thinking of a good example, like maybe down in the Agua Caliente area, where they've, achieved a major water right ruling, but they have agreed to help cleanse out, water systems and work together with their local water district. So it's kind of like a partnership.
So yeah, maybe, would we work with the Tribal Advisory Committee when we update this information, particularly subsequent water plan?
I think that data sharing is something very important amongst, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Indian Health Services with Department of Water Resources when it comes to this particular plan, and maybe establishing at the highest level for those two entities with the state would be a great accomplishment.
Good, thank you.
I think earlier when Francisco was scrolling through on our public comment website, the public comments are listed there, so you can see specific comments from other non-tribal as well as tribal comments. We have something there listed from the Tuvalu tribe as well as the Hopland Band of Pomo Indians. So there's probably others that are being worked on. So did I cut off somebody? Was somebody making a comment?
Can you hear me? Or
Yes,
not?
yes.
Oh, you can?
I can hear you. Yes.
This is Javier. Hi, this is Javier. I just wanted to make a comment. We are working on some comments. I did want to comment to the points made. I think that the capacity, so under the DWR's IRWM program, we're finding a lot of needs, needs of capacities for tribes. So I think that and probably small disadvantaged communities as well, non-tribal, but somewhere, so as we know, the tribes are at a disadvantage because of the lack of capacity. There are some tribes that have financial means to be able to participate in every action that happens across the state, such as the water plan. So I think that, and I think we've mentioned it before, where financing or assisting the tribes to participate, especially the ones that cannot, because that's a majority of the tribes in the state that cannot afford and don't have the capacity to participate in the California Water Plan. So I think that that's something, I don't know where that could be expressed. And also, I wanted to go to the challenges of the to the challenges, and I think that the critical challenges section, I kind of got a question, a comment. Why would the most critical challenges that are the most impossible for human, that are basically out of human control, are listed first? I think it should be flipped around. And I think where change can be applied, especially in these critical challenges, that's where they need to be up on top of this list, such as declining ecosystems, water quality degradation, aging and declining forest health. I think that should be a little bit more or up on the list. And then the changing demands for water. I mean, those are the things that we see are impacting water sustainability in California. So, and I think that was it. I do have some thoughts on the cultural landscapes, but it's a little bit more time. So I can submit some comments on that.
Thank you very much, especially on the definitions, and that's a good point on the prioritization. So I'm certain that our water planning team can take a look at that on how and why those are listed in that particular order.
There was no rationale, but I think that what Javier is suggesting makes sense.
And I did want to mention something about the cultural landscapes really briefly, and I know that it's mentioned about the watershed approach, integrated watershed management, and I think that, and according to like the State Water Resources Control Board's definition for beneficial use of water for tribes, in there we were, we definitely said work with those tribes in those areas where, get their perspectives of what a cultural landscape it is. But from like our perspective, it's really watershed scales, but some tribes are in multiple watersheds and not just in one huge watershed, such as the Sacramento or on those big river systems. A lot of them are on the coastal watersheds or even smaller watersheds where they don't see that huge impact. So to their own cultural landscape. So I think that that's one part of the definition is the area covered, which would be, like a watershed type scale. So just wanted to throw that in. But I will be submitting. Yeah.
That's great. And would your comments be coming from on behalf of Sherwood or from the North Coast, or that you're working on?
Yeah, they'll be on behalf of North Coast and
Okay.
reps and Sherwood if I'm able to swing that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yep.
One of the areas also for consideration is one of the actions that I've requested from our planning team was going into at the very beginning where we have the acronyms and abbreviations, and including a definition there on those were, if we make a cultural landscape definition or TEK, also we have tribes spelled called out throughout the document, or California Native American tribes. So my recommendation was, defining California Native American tribes as federally recognized and non-federally recognized throughout California, and that if we use the term tribes, it would have that definition. And if there's any other comments about other acronyms or abbreviations we should be using, this would be where we would have that in the document itself.
So, Anastasia, you mean to include like tribal communities too? That would include, right? Like unfederally recognized tribes. Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think that was one of my comments I provided, the written comments. I just want to give two more focuses here on my written comments. And one is, I think it's on page 3-4, we talked about, I think I recommend action 6.4. And it had to do with, I would like to see more focus on, we talk about data collection and that, but one of the areas that we use data for is mapping. And so I can't express enough how we need an official California GIS office that would help develop these GIS standards, effective data collection and sharing, analytic services for not only the state and our citizens, but for our partner entities like the federal folks, the tribal folks, your local governments, but that's something that we really need in the state of California.
And definitely in that recommended action of 6.4 would be a good place to raise it, if there's not any other areas. Especially if we're developing a regional water management atlas, it has to come from some source material. Right.
And I saw a really good presentation. I think Javier was there the other day, where there was an individual who did a good presentation on disadvantaged communities and water systems. And one of the layers that she was missing was where the tribes were located. And I promised to send her that link, and her name was Amanda Bensel, and she's from UC Davis. She's a PhD candidate in geography, and she did a really good study, and there's a really good web link that she provided that points to her research that she's done, and I thought she did a really good job on the locations of these particular water systems within disadvantaged communities.
Good. Thank you.
And Anacita, just real quick, because that just raised the question. This is Javier again. I mean, it raised the another point I wanted to bring up right now, and to make sure that it can be a little bit more defined or detailed in here regarding data and mapping and information available. I think and aligning state agencies. This all goes with it. I don't know what's going on with state agencies sometimes in their communications with each other, but the data needs to be synced up. I'm sorry, State Water Resource Control Board and DWR and Fish and Wildlife and CAL FIRE and Caltrans all need to have a same type of data portal or something, not all 5, 6 different types. I don't know. I'm just saying this because I think it's really difficult to sync all that data together, I guess. And it'd be really great if California could look at that, integrating data as well together. So
Javier, this is Kamiar. So recommended action 6.1 refers to AB 1755, which became law in 2016, and what you said just articulated as the need it has put into law. So state agencies are now working together to try to improve that coordination of publishing of our data.
Okay, sounds good. Perfect.
Yeah.
And it is also a link in the useful web links, the strategic plan that the AB 1755 group has done. I have to look at that to see whether there is that our tribal advisory committee can help inform that, because it's still in the nascent stages at this point. So what has been raised is important, and so I think that if it can't be obviously with comments, if things can be addressed through the water plan, we will do our best to address it or make those suggested modification or changes. There will probably be a list of things and items that we can't, and I'd like to maybe bookmark or table those items for discussions for how then we can inform other state agency planning or agencies and departments to look at. So, and I think that would be one, because if we're talking about alignment, it still may not be an alignment that would make assist with the tribal perspective of alignment. So, because then we'd have to look at the federal alignment and how we deal with, the regional alignments on the federal side with the federal agencies that tribes deal with.
Yes, this comes out. So one of the things that we pointed out earlier were what we call the support. And at on pages, after Chapter 4, there's the references in Chapter 5, and then section called supporting documents. And there are a number, about 15 listed here. We've already started considering adding some more. As you recall, over the last 2 cycles of the water plan, the proceedings of the Tribal Water Summit have been incorporated as a reference to the plan. So my point here is once the proceedings of the 2018 Tribal Water Summit become available, we would add it as a supporting document to this update of the water plan. And what we could do is we could put a placeholder in the plan and note that it'll be added. All the supporting documents are online, will be provided online. So I just wanted to put that out there, Anacita.
Yeah.
That was my, this is Donna. That was my second point of reference on my written comment, was I didn't see the reference of the 2018 California Tribal Water Summit, because there was much that was discussed by many of the California Native American tribes that were there, federal agencies and state agencies, in regards to water management, water planning. So, I look forward to, I don't know, are you guys going to do like a draft of that summary?
Internally, that draft is just being reviewed, and then I was going to call our tribal advisory committee together to finalize that document, and it's the
That sounds
highlight
great.
summary of the Tribal Water Summit.
Okay, sounds good.
So in respect for time, we've just got a minute or two left. Is there any other comments from anybody? Well, I would like to then thank everyone who participated and listened in, and Paul and Kamyar and our planning team here, and thank you very much for participating. If there's any information that we spoke about that you're looking for links or references, just feel free to, on the RSVP, you probably got the RSVP from Wally, so you can send that direct email to herself or to me. We'll be happy to help you with that. So thanks everyone, and have a rest of a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco.